Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason, and today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So yesterday we observed Russian cruise missile strikes all across Ukraine, hitting a variety of targets, and within the last 24 hours we have seen Ukrainian drones or cruise missiles attack Russian targets in the heavily defended Crimean Peninsula. Allegedly, Russian targets in Sevastopol, specifically fuel depot areas, were hit by Ukrainian cruise missiles. And it's interesting to see that the Ukrainians have that kind of capability to have the ability to penetrate Russian air defenses in Crimea. You have to imagine that other than Moscow and possibly St. Petersburg and some places up towards Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula has to be one of the most defended areas in the Russian Federation, yet the Ukrainians were able to hit targets in Sevastopol and destroy a number of fuel tanks in that city, or in that port city. Now, how are the Ukrainians doing this? Is it Ukrainian systems, or are the Western nations, North Atlantic Treaty Organization nations, United States, providing assets to the Ukrainians that is being used, and specifically some sort of stealth asset that is being used against these Russian targets? Or is simply the Russian air defense system inadequate for defending itself against very low-flying, semi-stealth, small cruise missiles or drones? Difficult to say at this point. The Ukrainians allege that they are able to shoot down the vast majority of Russian cruise missiles that are fired against targets inside of Ukraine. Now, we don't have any proof of that. Again, these are statements by the Ukrainians. Now, we did see over the past 48 hours that Russian cruise missile attack and Iskander ballistic missile attack. We saw one apartment building that was hit by a Russian cruise missile, and there were a number of civilian casualties, and I talked about that yesterday. Now, at the same time, the Ukrainians do not report on military casualties whatsoever. If these Russian cruise missiles were to have struck a barracks or military facility and caused a number of Ukrainian military casualties, the Ukrainians do not report on that. It is through other means in which we then have to obtain information in terms of what happened on the ground. I would say at this point, even the Russians are probably doing a little bit better of a job in terms of reporting casualties, especially casualties conducted by long-range cruise missiles or HIMARS or other systems that have targeted Russian barracks. And we have seen that. We have seen the Russians discuss the fact that a certain building was hit and a number of Russian soldiers were killed in that strike. We're not getting that from the Ukrainians. Again, very, very little information is getting out of Ukraine. And that kind of segues into another issue that I wanted to touch on briefly. So I've had the opportunity to receive a number of correspondence from persons inside of Ukraine, ordinary Ukrainian citizens living in Ukraine. And what they tell me, what they explain is going on, is kind of concerning. Well, it isn't kind of concerning, it is concerning. You are unable to criticize the Ukrainian government. If you were to criticize Zelensky, senior leaders of the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian state, you will find yourself labeled a Russian collaborator and then find yourself disappeared. So as we watch Western media discuss Ukraine being a democracy, a fledgling democracy, be it with a lot of corruption, is it? Is it really? Because again, the information that I receive coming from Ukrainian citizens inside of Ukraine portrays a very dark picture of what's happening. Now look, they are at war. They are at war, and in war, martial law is instituted. And that is what has happened inside of Ukraine. And it's difficult to say here in the United States what things would look like if there was fighting inside the United States. Difficult to say. But I don't believe at this point we are getting the full narrative, the truthful narrative. We know for certain that many of the Ukrainians that were portrayed on CNN, for instance, those individuals were planned to have discussions live on CNN well ahead of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And again, now with these very interesting correspondence that I've received, talking about just how scary it is in terms of the crackdown on public dissent, and then compounding that, the military draft that is occurring. So apparently, the draft age is 17, 18, and then goes all the way up to 27. But the reality is that you could be called in for service beyond the age of 27, and you have to report. And if you do not report, you are looking at a hefty fine and then possibly a prison sentence as well. So that's why we're seeing a lot of these, including content providers here on YouTube, fleeing Ukraine. They're getting the hell out. Why are they leaving? Well, they're not entirely leaving because of Russian cruise missile strikes. If they were on the front lines or near front line cities, yes, you could see them go elsewhere inside of Ukraine. In the early days of the conflict, they could leave Kiev. But now the western part of the country is relatively peaceful. So it's not like you don't have the ability to escape a conflict zone. You do. But in a lot of cases, these content providers and quite literally millions of people are getting out of Ukraine, fleeing. And I have a feeling it's for other reasons other than just escaping a conflict zone. It sounds like it is a very oppressive government, and that oppression is being hidden by the mainstream media, especially here in the United States. Again, here in the United States, the Ukrainian government can do no wrong. And when you have that kind of narrative that exists, that leads that government, that Ukrainian government, the ability to do things that could be incredibly nefarious. And we know it's happened. Thousands of people inside of Ukraine have been labeled Russian collaborators and have disappeared. It's a fact. So very interesting to see what's happening within that spectrum. And again, please continue to send correspondence. It's greatly appreciated to understand or try to understand what is happening in that country, especially when the United States is giving billions and billions and billions, sound like Carl Sagan, and billions of dollars. Bakhmut, again, as I talked about yesterday, essentially this is game over. And you're probably not going to hear much about it here in the United States. I don't think you're officially going to hear about the fall of Bakhmut. I think it's gently going to go quiet, and then another area of the conflict will become the key point of attention. But clearly, right now, the main defensive lines of the Ukrainian forces have been broken. There were 3 lines, one outside the city, one along the river, one along the railway system, just west of the administrative areas. And then finally, this is what's left in terms of the Ukrainians continuing to fight. And again, in all likelihood, it's because they simply can't. The Ukrainians, can't get out of this area. And again, it's very difficult to obtain truthful and correct information about what's happening on the ground. Again, from the Ukrainian side, you just hear about Russian human wave attacks. We don't believe that's the case. And then again, this is for the most part, Ukraine, not for the most part, it is a Ukrainian supportive map. And I use it. So that's where we're at for today. We will have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. Have a good day.